Here anymore. So Lion Women of Tehran is like a very fierce sounding title. But anyway, this is a book by an author who some of you I think might be familiar with. This is her third novel. She wrote, her first book was called Together Tea and was published in 2013. And then a few years after that came The Stationery Shop. And yes, remember, my memory is so bad, and one book kind of overlap takes away my memory of the other one, but I can't remember. I think we may have done it. Does anybody remember? No, I don't.
Didn't do it.
Or we didn't do it? Okay, you're good, you're trustworthy, but anyway, yes. So this is her third book, and she is a popular writer, and she's been, I listened to a couple of interviews with her recently, and it's very interesting because her books have been translated into many languages, and they are banned though in Iran, but they were translated into Persian, into Farsi. And because she said, I know, because she lives in the States, but she has friends who are still in Iran. And she said, I know that people are reading it there, but it's officially in Spanish. It's also one of the many languages that it's been translated into, also interestingly, is Hebrew, which, Hebrew Israelis read voraciously. I think everything that they can get their hands on is translated into Hebrew, but kind of interesting, when I picked the title, it was many months ago, not that Iran hasn't been in the news for years now, but in the last couple of months, even a few weeks, it's been particularly for those of us who follow the news in the Middle East and in Israel, it's been very, very timely. So I thought, oh, this has really worked out well. This is an interesting book to do. So as I said, this is her third novel. Her background is interesting. And when I first read her books, I thought, oh, are they and I didn't do my librarian thing and check the cataloging and publication stuff and to see whether the book was translated. And sometimes her writing, and I found this in this book as well at the beginning, had a quality that I thought, this could have been something that read like a translation of that she wrote it in, what I thought would have been Farsi and translated into English. Had a little bit of that flavor, which doesn't detract from it because it's about when she's writing about Iran, she's writing about, it would make sense. But no, she writes in English. And if you've heard her, I don't know if anybody listened to interviews with her, her English is flawless, like unaccented, perfect. So her background is interesting. She was born in Turkey in 1971, which makes her 54 years old, to Iranian parents. Her father was a diplomat who traveled extensively, because if you look at the little blurb at the back of the book, it says that Marjan Kamali was born in Turkey to Iranian parents, spent her childhood in Kenya, Germany, Turkey, Iran, and the United States. And then it talks about her degrees. So I thought, so her father, makes sense that her father was a diplomat who traveled extensively. And the family accompanied him to his posting. So there was Germany, there was Kenya, where the Kamali children, and they went to school wherever they were. So they went to an English school in Kenya. And they read, I thought this was interesting because these were books that I read as a child, and she's younger than I am, but Enid Blyton novels. Does anybody remember Enid Blyton novels? They were British. And I guess if you grew up anywhere, I don't know, Canada was part of the Dominion at the time. I think I was reading them. They were so British, and my little corner library in the neighborhood that I lived in, which was a French neighborhood predominantly, but they had all her books and I loved them. And so I thought that was so interesting that here's this author who was, I think, she's 50 or however many years younger than I am, and she's reading Enid Blyton novels by the dozens. And eventually her father, after being posted to these different countries, they arrived in post-revolution Iran in 1980. So that's just after, remember, 1979 was when the Shah was forced to leave. He was overthrown and the Ayatollah took over. Officially, there had been revolutionary activity increasing over the last 2 years before, but it was 1979. So they came back, she and her family, to Iran in 1980, and she was 9 years old at the time. Interestingly, she said that while English books had become less common in schools, because before that, and I imagine that if one was the child of the diplomat, one went to the better schools in Iran, and English and French, it seems too, were also taught. So English books, but then the Ayatollahs came in, and that was probably considered Western and not something that would be approved of. But in any case, the family still had the classics in their home, even if they weren't in schools, stationery shops where one bought books in Iran, or libraries. She still was able to read the classics in English. In fact, she said that her older sister was so adamant that Marjan's English language skills not falter, that she, the older sister, precociously took upon herself the role of tutor, even going so far as to assign book reports. This is one sister, the older sister being the teacher to the other one and making sure. But then, not only was there the revolution when the Shah left and the Ayatollah Khomeini came in, but then the Iran-Iraq War took place. So she remembers the bombs raining down on Tehran during the Iran-Iraq War, and she having to go into the basement when the sirens go, and going into the basement. And she said, but we took books with us, and books there were a very good escape, at least as best as one could escape into the world of, and by then she was reading Jane Austen, Charles Dickens, and the Bronte sisters. So really the classics, that's what she read. And often an author, when they're asked, I notice when I listen to interviews or read interviews, when an author is asked, and what advice would you give to up and, aspiring would-be writers? And it very often is, read as much as you can. So it seems like she did that even when she was a child. In 1982, they left Tehran very quickly. I don't know exactly, she didn't say what the reasons were, but they left and they moved to Queens, the Forest Hills, Queens in New York City, where she continued to enjoy, as she says, her reading, her discovering now the American classics, not just the British classics, but the American classics in middle school and high school. So you can see she grew up with English. And Farsi was probably, I'm thinking, spoken at home, but English was very strong. So that's why when you listen to her speak, her English is flawless. She writes in English, there's no translation required. In 1993, she graduated from UC Berkeley with a BA in English literature, and she got married shortly after that. So she was a good traditional Iranian girl in the sense that she married pretty young. She and her husband, and I don't know what her husband does, because I thought, I wonder if he's a scientist like the husband in the book. But in any case, they moved to Basel in Switzerland, where she worked as a scientific publications editor. So she's done all kinds of writing, but she started out writing this technical, scientific publications, or editing it anyway, but you have to be able to write it too. And she said Basel was very convenient because, it's nicely located in Switzerland, extensive sightseeing through Germany and France. And in those years, she began writing what she calls her little stories, and she dreamed one day of writing more seriously. When she and her husband moved back to New York in the late 1990s, she enrolled at Columbia Business School in the MBA program. Why would you say she did that? Because she said she decided that she should be practical, because the English literature degree was not very practical. But she said, the entire time that I was there, I felt like a fish out of water. I was just doing this because I thought this would be a practical degree to have. And she said that when she was in one of her courses there at Columbia, the MBA program, she got the idea for a short story that would become the first chapter of her debut novel, Together Tea, which, as I said, was published in 2013. And how did this happen? I thought this was fun. She was taking a class on spreadsheets, because that's what you do in business school, or at least you did in business school then. And suddenly she couldn't, because she was really a writer, not such a business person, she started to think of these ideas of bizarre potential uses for spreadsheets, such as rating one's eligibility for marriage. And it wasn't long before she was drafting the tale of an Iranian mother who, to the great dismay of her daughter, uses spreadsheets to rate potential sons-in-law. While she was still working on this business degree, she met up with one of her old professors from Berkeley, and he teased her for being a business school sellout and read the short story that she had just written about the spreadsheet loving matchmaker, and which made me think of Indian Matchmaker, that really funny, anyway, so that was, so she said, he said to her, this former professor, he said to her, you know what this is, don't you? This is the first chapter to your first novel. So it was as if he said to her, okay, this is what you should be doing. So she was inspired by his words. She enrolled in the Master of Fine Arts program for creative writing at NYU. And she said, and then she had this crazy double life. She was living in New Jersey. She would go to classes at Columbia for her business degree by day, and then she would commute down to Greenwich Village and attend writing workshops with all of her artsy liberal friends by night. She said it was quite an overwhelming schedule to keep, and yet, while she was doing it, she was thinking of all the girlfriends she had left behind in Iran, whose opportunities for education had been restricted. So that was an idea that was already on her mind then, which is a large part of this, her most recent book. She said she admits that she suffers from what she calls a sense of immigrant guilt, knowing how lucky she was to have escaped a place, to have had the ability to leave Iran, where there in America she had so many more options than those of her friends and family left behind. And so therefore she persevered, even though, and she got both degrees, by the way. She has a business degree, her business degree from Columbia, and she has her fine arts degree from NYU. Then she had her first child. She said that she needed a little break from universities because taking care of a baby is all time consuming. But by the end of 2002, just before her second child was born, she had completed, that's when she completed both degrees, and she handed in a creative writing thesis, which she entitled Together Tea, which became the first novel. In 2004, she moved to Australia. Again, I'm not sure, maybe the husband, there's no way to find out why, to Australia, another English-speaking country. And by that time, she had children to care for. Her children were young. She said, I could barely string a sentence together, never mind, writing stories. And finally, after moving back to the Boston area, which is where she lives today, and dropping her youngest child off at his first day of kindergarten, she went home and it was all quiet. And she thought, okay, now what am I going to do with myself? The kids are in school and I have time. And her husband said to her, you remember you had this manuscript stashed away. And she went back to it and she said, oh, this is about a daughter who is so hard on her poor mother. Parenthood had given her a new sense of sympathy for that story's, the Together Tea's, meddlesome matriarch. So she began heavily editing the manuscript. She changed the tense. I thought this was interesting. She wrote it originally in present tense, which is popular in young adult literature, fiction, and she changed it to the past. And then she decided to tell the story from the perspectives of both the mother and the daughter, alternating between chapters. And she explores in that book, especially in the second half, how the daughter and the mother, who are often at odds, seek to heal their relationship and address their own existential crises in a way that, in that book, that shocks their family and friends because they took a vacation to Iran together. So mother-daughter relationships, that was from her first novel, and here, very much so again. Yes, this is a book about friendship. That's the main theme, is the story of the friendship between the two girls. How many of you read the book, just to give me an idea? Oh, a lot. Okay, good. So I could do, I don't know, spoiler alerts because many of you, anyway, but so mother-daughter relationships. So she lives, and then she taught business writing at at Boston University for a number of years, and I looked, from what I could see now, she teaches at Brandeis, which is also in the Boston area, but she teaches, and I don't think it's business writing anymore. I think it's she's a creative writing teacher. So she believes that her work is very timely, that it's important for her, and she's believed that ever since she started writing, to write about Iran. And since she was living in America, in the United States, that she felt that she, even through her fiction, she could give American readers, or she hopes she could give American readers, a greater understanding of life for both Iranians and Americans and Iranian Americans, that hyphenated people, because when one comes from a different country, very often, depending on circumstances, you are still a hyphenated person. And she says, but no matter, even though regardless of ethnic or national affiliations of her characters, she hopes what she's doing in her book is telling universal stories of families and friends, of lovingly crafted meals, and there's a lot about food and cooking. In fact, the publisher apparently even published a kind of addendum to the book. I didn't see it so clearly, but it was in one of the interviews that when the interviewer held this up and said, you know, there's so many wonderful mouth-watering recipes that I can't wait to try them all. And then she said, and look what I just found. The recipes that you mentioned that Homa's mother made and that other characters make. And of course, by the end of the story, Ellie has opened up a restaurant. So food is a very, very big part, as it often is when we read stories about immigrants. You notice that because food is so much part of one's growing up and of one's childhood and memories, and because it comes with taste, it comes with smell, it comes with who you cook the food with, and it's very, very evocative. So in this book, you can almost, I don't know what, smell the saffron and smell the spices and look at the colors. And so there is this, I don't know whether one can buy it but this little handout booklet that comes with it, with the recipes of this book. So she puts these meals and descriptions of meals and food into her stories. Art, she likes to write about art and the creative impulse. And most importantly, she says she wants to point out the transformative power of empathy, right? Empathy as opposed to sympathy. Empathy is trying to put yourself in someone else's place and understand them. So in this latest book of hers, her third novel, The Lion Women of Iran, she has two girls, those of you who read it know, named Ellie and Homa. And in the story, they share the joys of childhood, they weather the ups and downs of adolescence, and they go off to university together. So as just a brief summary for those few of you who didn't read the book. So these two girls are growing up in Tehran. The book that's where it's set at the beginning. They meet at school in first grade in the early 1950s. And she tells us that she was born in the character in the book, Ellie, who is the main character. The book alternates point of view. You have some chapters written by Homa. There are two girls, the two friends, but the majority of the book is written by Ellie. And the two of them meet when they are 7 years old and entering first grade. So that's the early 1950s. They were born in 1943, yes. And even though their families are very different, they become very close friends. They have this kind of friendship that is a friendship for life. And it's something that is very powerful. And Marjan Kamali likes to write about this kind of friendship. After the death in the story, after the death of Ellie, who's the main voice, after the death of her father, she and her difficult mother, another difficult mother character, must adapt to their reduced circumstances, because Ellie, after all, her mother tells her, I come from a line, I'm very aristocratic, I come from a royal line. You, meaning you, Ellie. And Ellie's name, Elele, means princess in Persian. So that's her name, as opposed to her friend Homa, whose name, Homa is a mythical bird. And I think those of you who, I don't know, they're different cover, I don't know if they're different covers, but the cover of the book that I have has this most of what looks like, trying to figure out what it was, but a mythical bird. A bird. Yeah, I know. First I thought it was a dragon, but I'm not sure. I think it's supposed to be a bird, or at least some kind of a mythical creature. It has wings and it has claws, and it's got like a very Persian looking cover. Anyway, so so Ellie comes from this aristocratic upper class family. Remember, it's Iran in the 1950s, and there were very strong class divisions. But her father dies when she's 7 years old, and she's loved her father. She adored her father. Her father suddenly dies. He becomes sick and he dies. And then she and her difficult mother, who it turns out father didn't leave money for them, and there was no family money, even though her mother came from this aristocratic family. And what to do? The uncle, her late father's brother, would like to marry her mother, but her mother is not interested. And so the uncle, generously or whatever, we don't know the motives at the time, he pays for them to move to a small apartment downtown, not in the suburbs where Ellie had been living until then, in that beautiful house with the courtyard and the servants, where her mother never lifted a finger and would never dream of going shopping on her own for groceries or cooking food, and didn't know how to do anything. They have to move to this little 2-room apartment in a downtown, not very nice neighborhood. So to Ellie, it's fine. Doesn't make a difference to her. She's 7 years old. What difference does that make to her? As long as she has something to eat and as long as she has a place to go and her mother is with her. She's very upset about the death of her father because she loved her father. But her mother finds this just terrible because, as we are introduced to her mother, she is a snob of snobs. And the idea of moving to this lower class neighborhood, she still, as the author describes her, lifts her skirts up as she walks in the street, as if she's going to be contaminated somehow by the dirt on the streets. And there they go, and they live, and they've had to move there. And that's where Ellie is enrolled in this public school in a not very nice neighborhood. And she dreams of having a friend. That's her dream, to have a good friend. And she imagines what she's going to do with this friend, and they're going to share secrets, and they're going to sit together, and it's just going to be wonderful. And she is lucky, and she meets this friend the first day of school. This girl who is quite a force at age 7, she's tall and thin, with head of black curly hair. And she comes up to her and she introduces herself. And from that moment on, the two of them are best friends. So while Ellie and her mother are living in this little 2-room apartment, and Ellie's mother is very upset about that, Homa, her friend, has a warm and loving family. They live definitely a more financially constrained life than Ellie came from, and the father is a communist. The mother is already then, she's described as wearing a chador, but she's a lovely, warm woman. And this Homa has younger siblings, and the kitchen is warm and full of smells and cooking going on. And to Ellie, this is a place she always goes to, Homa's house after school, because this is the place that she feels very comfortable, and the family is so kind to her and so warm. Her mother, of course, never wants Homa to come to their house. First of all, she's ashamed at where they're living, and also she's like very upset that her daughter has to associate with this riffraff, but there's no choice because that's where they're living and that's the school she's going to. Homa's father, her mother is at home looking after the children and taking care of the house and shopping and cooking these wonderful meals. Her father is a communist. He's an intelligent man, he's hardworking, but his beliefs are he's a communist and he's politically active, which turns out to be to his own detriment and that of his family's welfare, as he is arrested. But then what happens? The fortunes are reversed once again. Ellie's mother remarries. She decides to marry the uncle who's wanted to marry her, and she and Ellie relocate back up to a more exclusive part of the city, and the girls become separated. They're separated for a few years. Ellie is so distraught at the idea of having to leave her friend, but there's no choice. Her mother, of course, is elated. They're going back to where they belong. And And Ellie goes to a new high school, and it's a very elite high school, full of wealthy girls and girls from the kinds of families that Ellie's mother is very happy. And Ellie starts to forget Homa's no longer part of her life. And then one day, in typical Homa fashion, she appears barreling through the gates of this high school. And she's tried, as she tells Ellie, here I am. And Ellie, so Homa, the two characters of the girls are very interesting because Homa is presented as an idealist, as and the title of the book, The Lion Women of Tehran. So the Lion Women of Tehran means, you just know when you're reading it, that we're being told here the story of these very strong, fierce women. And apparently the term, because she uses it in the book in the original Persian, in Farsi, is shir zan, which are lion women. And so these two girls, even though Ellie might not seem to be such a lion woman at the beginning, but Homa definitely, from the minute we meet her as a 7-year-old girl, we have this feeling that's the kind of girl, that's the kind of woman she is going to be. And so here comes Homa. She's worked really hard, and she's tried for years to get into the high school that Ellie goes to because it is the best high school. And Homa, even when they're little girls in elementary school, has said to her, we are going to study, we are going to make something of ourselves, we are going to go to university, because that's the time when the Shah came in, the second Shah, Reza Pahlavi, and that women were allowed. There were all these, because that Shah's mission was to, among other things, to westernize Iranian society. So it became very secular, in fact, to the point where women were not supposed to cover their hair or wear hijab, because the Shah's goal was to become as Western as possible, to bring his country up into modern times, modern Western times. And so women were allowed to go to school, women were allowed to study whatever they want, they were able now to go to work, and things had changed. So it seemed like it was going to be a wonderful time, and Homa now appears at this high school. She's finally gotten herself into it because she's very, very bright and very hardworking, and she appears, and Ellie is a little bit not so sure what to do now, because just as Homa she's brave and she's loyal and she doesn't care what anybody else thinks, and she doesn't care what anybody else has, material goods, things are not important to her. Ellie is, much as she likes to criticize her mother for being so superficial and materialistic and only looking at where somebody comes from and how much money they have and what class they belong to, Ellie has a bit of has rubbed off on her as well, understandably. But so she's there in this high school, managed to make her way into the group of popular girls, and all of a sudden comes this Homa from out of the blue. And what's going to happen? Are they still going to be able to be friends? Is Ellie going to have to give up her friendships? The friendship continues. The friendship is still very strong. And the girls finish high school, and Homa is pushing Ellie. You have to study, because we have to get into university, and we're both going to become lawyers, and I want to become a judge so that I can rule and I can make decisions that are favorable for women. She's very politically active, even from a young age, and she pushes, and Ellie follows the course. And while Homa works towards scholastic success and begins, following in her father's footsteps, to practice political activism, Ellie is more, yes, she goes on to university, she meets a nice young man who she thinks maybe he's going to ask her to marry him, which is what she would be, she's in love, she thinks he's very wonderful, and this is what she's looking forward to. So even though, yes, things are very modern there, the girls are also encouraged to get married at a young age. And so the girls eventually, they are not able to finish university. Things happen in the plot, as you know, those of you who read it, those of you who don't, and maybe will read it, the politics comes into play. And their torturous path of the girls' adult friendship over the following decades is played out against regime change. There is political persecution and there is loss. And Ellie's well-intentioned but naive, she is so naive, approach stands in stark contrast to Homa's commitment to human rights, and particularly those for women, and her willingness, Homa's willingness to risk personal safety to secure those rights for others. She's not thinking of herself, it's for others. So, as largely narrated by Ellie, the girl's story incorporates the times, and it incorporates the sights and the sounds of Tehran, and of, at one point they go on hikes, which reminded me, I think it was in her other book too, where the girls were going hiking in the mountains surrounding Tehran. And so there's a lot of color and vibrancy to the writing. And she also puts in the customs and the beliefs common in the years of tumult and the reforms accompanying the Iranian Revolution, meaning the different revolutions, because the Shah's revolution was referred to as the White Revolution when the Shah came in, and that was a series of laws. I went back to see just a little bit to review the history of Iran. So the Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi was born, he's the Shah that we know here, that we meet during this time frame. He was born in 1919 in Tehran, and he died in July of 1980 in Cairo. Remember, he was forced to leave in 1979, and America would not take him in. He was very sick with cancer at the time. I think he went to be treated, I think maybe France and Switzerland, and he died in Cairo. He was the Shah of Iran from 1941 to 1979. So he was also an autocrat. Like, this was not a democracy. He was very pro-Western, but it was not a democracy in the sense that we know it in North America. The autocracy of his rule, because she talks about this in the book. In 1953, there was a coup, because that's what I didn't know about that part. The 1979 revolution I remember, but in 1953, and she talks about it in the book. I mean, the character only would have been 3 years old, Ellie, but she mentions it here, in which the UK, and it's a little bit of history background, and the US helped to restore the Shah to power after there was a 2-year standoff with the parliament, and he had to flee the country. So then he came back, and he implemented, or he imposed, depending how you look at it, aggressive economic development policies, including the modernization program, which was known as the White Revolution. And this program rapidly, and perhaps this was, I looked at different analyses, but perhaps this was one of the reasons that Ayatollah Khomeini in the late 1970s was able to come into power, because the Shah's White Revolution, this modernization program, rapidly upended the traditional power structures in the country. And it heightened the tensions that eventually led to Mohammad Reza's downfall in 1979. And so that was the thing, because I didn't understand. She makes reference in March of 1951 that there was a zealous Iranian nationalist, Mosaddegh, and he secured passage of a bill in the parliament to nationalize. This was to do with oil interests, because the British had vast petroleum interests in Iran. So oil has been a big factor in the Middle East for many years. And then there was this 2-year period of tension and conflict between 1951 and 1953. And in 1953, the Shah tried and failed to dismiss Mosaddegh. And after riots broke out, he had to flee the country. Anyway, then there was back and forth battle. And eventually, according to this article, I don't know, the United States and the United Kingdom restored Mohammad Reza back to power in 1953. And so the oil industry was nationalized, but that was only nominally. And then there was an agreement. Anyway, there was all this stuff with the oil industry going on. But what was the actual White Revolution? Things that don't seem bad at all. Construction, it included construction of expanded road, rail, and air, a network in Iran. So it really brought Iran into the into the 20th century, a number of dam and irrigation projects, the eradication of diseases such as malaria, the encouragement and support of industrial growth, and land reform. He also established a literary corps and a health corps for the large, because at the time it was largely a rural society in Iran, and there was land reform and education. And so what he did was he sought to develop a more independent foreign policy as well. He established working relationships with the Soviet Union and the Eastern European nations. So he had support because of what he did. He also changed laws for women, and that's what she refers to here too. Women were now granted more freedoms. And as the child custody laws, because that comes into play at the end of the story when Ellie's mother says to her, you know, if I ever would have wanted to leave your father, I could never have done it because I would have lost you, because a woman never got to keep the children, which is like different than it's been here for the last number of years, when it was usually the woman who got it. Was never like that. And so he really improved the situation, or he modernized the situation of women. But what the Shah faced was continuing political criticism for those who felt either that his reforms did not move far or fast enough. At the same time, he faced religious criticism from those who believed that Westernization was antithetical to Islam. And so while the Shah was battling these two different, criticism coming from different places, he also was an autocratic ruler. It wasn't that this was, as I said, not a democracy. He was an autocrat. There was corruption in his government. There was unequal, these were the criticisms of him, unequal distribution of oil wealth, forced Westernization, what I said, that the opposite of now in Iran, where women are forced to cover up. Apparently they were forced to take off the hijab and a veil if they walked in the street under the Shah, who did not like this. He had his secret police, the notorious Sava, and he suppressed dissent and opposition to his rule. So there were definitely negative aspects to his rule, and they became markedly accentuated after Iran began to reap greater revenues from its petroleum exports, which began in 1973. Remember 1973, that's when oil prices started to go up astronomically, and all kinds of things changed. So the whole geopolitical background is really very interesting. She puts it into the book. She puts it in, in bits and pieces. She definitely fills it in. But I wanted to learn a little more, which is why I just read you this bit, because anyway, there's more to it. I'm not going to read you several pages, because it was very interesting to me, because I remember the revolution, I remember the Shah leaving and Khomeini coming in 1979, but the what went on before and what went on 20 and 30 years earlier, it all led up to this. So she provides the reader, which is good, which is, I guess, and this is funny, when somebody asked me what kind of a book is it, I guess I would not have said historical fiction, but it is historical fiction. So I think of, maybe because I think the historical fiction as being, I don't know, before the 20th century, but I guess 50, 60 years, 70 years ago was historical fiction too. And there was an interesting review on with a historical fiction book club that she was speaking to. And it was very interesting, because one of the questions was, you put in, like the interviewer was asking the author, you put in a lot about the Iranian, what was going on in Iran at the time that you're writing about, which goes from 1950, let's say 1950, to at the very end, 2022. But the main part of the book is between the 1950 and the early 1980s. And there's this little postscript at the very end later on. But the interviewer said to her, so as a writer of historical fiction, that's when I thought, oh, historical fiction? Okay, I don't usually read historical fiction, but I guess we read historical fiction now if anything has something from older than, I don't know, what's considered historical fiction.
The past, it just has to be a real, true background.
Okay, so yes, so this is interesting. So the question was, that the interviewer said to her, if you're writing in this book, which is, call it historical fiction, how well, first of all, why did you do it like that? And she, who now, after reading about her, she wrote nonfiction as well. She was writing, business manuals and editing scientific manuals. So she wrote nonfiction, but this is her storytelling, she says, is my thing, like to be a storyteller, a la Scheherazade, like there's a long tradition of women weaving stories. So this is what she wants to do. And she said that she is very careful in her history part to be factual. And she said, I know, because the interviewer said to her, there's historical fiction from the, 13th century and 14th century, and when people write stories about, I don't know, different eras and times, and even older than that. So maybe it's not, I don't know, I'm just saying this, not as important that every fact is really there and accurate. But she says, the author says, for me, when I wrote this book, it was very important for me to get the facts very accurate, because reading it, I thought, if somebody doesn't know, and if a young person who, wasn't alive at the time when the Shah was deposed, or just any of this, and hasn't read history, which very unfortunately, I think a lot of people, and especially, I don't know what they teach nowadays, history, but I don't know, that they have no idea. So if if readers, and this is a very easy to read book, she has a very, she's a very good storyteller. She develops her character, she makes the two girls and their relationship and their friendship and the power of friendship and the mother-daughter relationship, it's all very readable. But if somebody is who doesn't know anything about Iranian history, is going to read it, it should be accurate. Everything should be accurate, because people, and this sometimes I found fault with books where there are inaccuracies that even I, as a non-historian or non so well-read in history, notice that to me, that's dangerous. Even though, yes, it's fiction, so you can't, and she pointed that out. She said, if I was writing nonfiction, I would definitely feel that every single fact has to be accurate, because it's nonfiction, which is why biography is like a tricky kind of in-between area, or memoir, sorry, not biography, memoir or autobiography is hazy, because, our memories are very fallible. So that could be, it's classified usually as nonfiction, but sometimes definitely could be fiction sometimes. But she says here, no, I have to be very, very careful, and I want to make sure, even in my fiction, that everything is accurate. So whatever you read here, for example, I looked up when there's that bit about the fire in the movie theater, where Homa's husband is that horrible, horrible fire. And there's some references to who set the fire. Was it set by Muslim extremists who locked those theater doors and set the fire to the theater? Or was it really, as they said, playing the Shah and his agents in order to make the Islamic, give them a bad name? In any case, hundreds of people were killed in that fire. And yes, it's true, and it was exactly that right date, and it was exactly the time. So what she says, that was just one of the things I checked, but the rest of it, I'm sure, but she said she did it very much on purpose. So the history is accurate, and which is, I think, very good for the reading public, because it's an easy read, it's a nice story, you can give it to girls, they're going to like it, I would give it to anybody, I'm not belittling it, but because it's easily readable, it will reach a larger audience, and they will learn things. And because she lives in America, and she's lived in America for most of her adult life, she has a very interesting perspective. When she was asked, where did you get the idea for this book? She says that she got the idea because she had a friend. She had a friend when she was a young girl, and they were very good friends. And then she left. Marjan was able to leave, and she lost touch with this good friend of hers in Iran. And she said, she said, after my second book, The Stationery Shop, came out, I had started writing the next one when the pandemic began. So that was 2020. This book was published in 2024. And she said, as I did what many people did during lockdown, I scrolled Instagram. I saw posts from a woman in Iran who was my friend, not on social media, but once upon a time in real life. We had been best friends in elementary school, playing together, doing homework, and sharing dreams and hopes about the kind of women we would one day become. And as I looked at my friend, because she's her Instagram friend now, her friend's Instagram post, and saw her liking mine, I wondered again about the different directions that our lives had taken. Here I was, an author in America, and there she was working at a human rights organization in Iran, which seems perilous at best. She said, I couldn't stop thinking about how the friends that we make when we are young shape us. And that's really very true. And I think we all, if we're blessed to have had a good friend when we are young, whether we're still friends with them, lucky or not, if we are or not, because I mean, mostly probably not, but how those friendships shape us and how their influence lasts even if their friendship doesn't. And she said, I think friendship breakups are just as heart-wrenching as romantic ones. So I knew I had to write the story of a broken friendship. I threw away that other, or put it in a drawer, but I gave up that manuscript, which I think she had said it was about 4 women in Massachusetts somewhere getting together because their youngest or their first child, I don't know, were all applying to colleges, which, you know, if you're in America and you're a certain like kind of people who believe in education is very important. So this college application thing is a very large, several year, thing for your kids or for the parents of these kids. So she said, but she put that aside because she realized I had to do this now. Now that she saw the post of this friend of hers in Iran, that she started to do that. And that's when she started writing The Lion Women of Tehran. That was her impetus. And she also made another comment which kind of hit home to me because she said, I remember that this friend I had who I met when I was the same age as I have Ellie and Homa meeting here, 7 years old, first grade, which is often the time that you make a good friend. I mean, okay, kids have play dates now, as they call them when they're little, and they get taken over and that, but it's, you have to be there has to be a certain level of maturity in order to understand the concept of friendship, and maybe precocious girls at 7 years old, not maybe, but they are able to do that. And she said, I still remember, and I remember having this feeling too, and I'm sure many of you do, that the first time that you go over on your own to somebody else's house, to a friend's house or whoever's house, usually let's say a friend's house, you're invited over after school, and you go into this other house and you see, oh, this is very different from my house. And not in a, not in a bad way necessarily, but just the difference, because until then you are so much, if you have a normal, like lucky to have a normal family life, that you're in your own home. And the food that's cooked in your own home is the food you're used to. The parents you got or the family you have around you is what you're used to. And then you go to this other house and there's another family living with their kinds of foods and in their house, and the teapot is over there and the sofa's there. And as she said, okay, now in our day, the television is over there. Back in that day, it was the courtyard had those kinds of flowers. Even Homa's not fancy house had a courtyard, which in Iran seems to have been, at least in Tehran, if you had, a lovely courtyard and was part and the house at the back. So that was a feeling, she said, that all that came back to her. So she said, that's when I started seriously to write that book. So the one about the college application, that was put aside, and she started that. And she says that when she's asked the question, how much of this book, because, those of you who read it, there's that whole story back and forth, and she goes to America. In fact, the book opens, I like the opening. Do you remember the book opens in the modern day, except for the, as I say, the end has the 2022 bit, kind of a postscript. But the opening scene is December 1981, and it's Ellie is talking, and she writes, I stood on the lacquered floor, a small woman in black with a rectangular name badge on my chest. My coiffed, contented look was calculated, so I'd appear not just satisfied, but quietly superior. That's a great, a great opening two sentences. In America, I learned the secret to becoming a successful salesperson was to act like one of the elite, as if spritzing perfume on customers' blue-veined wrists was doing them a favor. I mean, that's great. So because you get a lot into that she's got this idea that she has to look like this. And after you get through a little bit of the book, you realize in Iran, it was probably very different. First of all, when she grew up, the clothes were not, not ready-made. The tailors and the dressmakers came to the likes of her mother. And she would never be, her mother never would have been working. So this was very different. But it's so interesting that she realizes, or she's learned that the secret to being a successful salesperson, whether you agree with this or not, this is what she said, was to act like one of the elite. And think of the ladies, it's funny because now there's no more Bay. I was gonna say the Bay, but anyway. You used to go and at the downtown Bay, when you walk in, there was the perfume counter, and there were those lovely ladies, and they were all wearing black, because that was the uniform of the salespeople, or sales associates, as they were called in later years. Offering you, like they spritz on your wrist anymore, but this little card with whichever perfume that you wanted, and if you wanted a spritz, you could get one. But this quietly superior, and yes, they're elegantly coiffed and they're smiling, but satisfied but quietly superior, she says, and then she continues, a sea, and we don't know which store she's working at yet, a sea of haughty New Yorkers swerved to avoid my spray. And and now I go back and I listen to, there's a lot of nice alliteration here. My coiffed, contented look was calculated so I'd appear not just satisfied but quietly superior. A sea of haughty New Yorkers swerved to avoid my spray. Thank God for the more down-to-earth women, the cooks and bakers coming up to the first floor from the basement home goods section. They were too polite to reject the fragrant droplets I offered. Orange, lily, jasmine, and rose notes nestled in the lines of my palms and the fibers of my clothes. So then I thought, I haven't been, she works at Bloomingdale's. Anyway, that's the department store. We found out that that's where she is. First, I thought maybe it was Macy's, because Macy's, the home's good in the main store down there on Herald Square, it's on the basement. But anyway, and then her colleague comes and she says, boy, look at you, you're going to take over the whole brand. I better watch my back. And so we meet her and we find out that she lives on the Upper East Side, and she's working at the cosmetics counter at Bloomingdale. But right on the second page, there's another aspect to her and to her mother's story, which was, she says, my mother, and so her coworker Angela, who's her friend as well, comes from her break, and then she says and that's when she says to Ellie, oh boy, look at you, you're doing really well. I think, you're just going to take over the whole brand. And so she writes, I batted away Angela's compliments and said I wasn't doing all that well, really. And I had a headache because I hadn't eaten all day. She says, my mother always said the envy of others invites the evil eye to cast doom on us. And this is a big part of the story too. Her mother is always telling her about the evil eye, which apparently is a big thing in Persian culture, but as the author says, it's a big thing in many cultures, this idea that, don't flaunt your good things, don't say that, in Jewish we have the expression, is an ayin hara, that there's the evil eye, even though we're not supposed to believe in stuff. There's still, you don't want to, or call it tempt fate if you want to be, I don't know what, more irreligious or irreligious. But she says, so that's what my mother told me. She'd often told me that being perceived as too competent, happy, or successful could summon misfortune. I knew belief in the powers of other people's jealousy and the jinxing of an evil eye needed to be cast off. But at the age of 38, in the middle of that massive Manhattan department store, I was still unwittingly beholden to superstition. The truth of who I was could not be escaped, nor could the flaw I had spent years trying to quash and erase. The guilty one had always been me. So right in there, this is what a good storyteller she is. So she sets the stage, there she is. I mean, we still don't know yet Bloomingdale's, but it doesn't matter, in this department store in Manhattan. She's 38 years old, she's working in the cosmetics counter, she comes from somewhere else. And her mother told her, no, you have to be very careful. You don't want anybody to envy you for anything, because they're going to cast an evil eye of envy on you. But what was this flaw that she had spent years trying to quash and erase? And why was she what was she guilty of? So you catch that right there at the beginning. And then we find out right in the next page that what's happened, what starts the story off on its narrative arc, is that she's received a letter, because remember 1981, back in the day, it's letters, believe it or not, which is like, letters. She's received a letter from a friend, her childhood friend, who she hasn't seen in 17 years, purposely estranged, as she writes on page 5. We had been I get a Persian word for it, with no contact save one pleasant encounter. Now her letter was in my hands. How did she know how to find me? She must have gotten my address from mother. On one page of Homa, so her name is Homa, and she tells us, as we were friends together, she was my childhood friend. We'd sat on the same elementary school bench in downtown Tehran. We'd played hopscotch in our neighborhood alley. We'd raced to schools with our satchels bouncing on our hips. We had zigzagged through the mazes of the Grand Bazaar and shared ice cream sandwiches and dreams for the kind of women we would become. Anyway, she gets this letter after 17 years from Homa. First page is filled with questions about Ellie's life in America. And the second one was about her situation in Iran. Her health is good, but she says, my mind is not at ease. You would recognize this country. I don't know where we went wrong, Ellie, she writes her. At the bottom was a sentence about her daughter and how her daughter loved to sing. And she closed the letter with, can you call me Ellie? Please, my number is, I need to speak to you, it's urgent. And she doesn't know what to do, and her husband says to her, you should call her. It's good that she's reached out. You were the best of friends. It's time to air it all out, Ellie. Speak to her. How I wish it was so simple. She says, I couldn't blame Homa for cutting contact, but now she had flown back into my life, all innocence and zest, which are her Homa's characteristics, creating a crater of questions with her sign off. It's urgent. So what's she going to do? And we don't know what she is going to do. And then we get the story. And then from that opening in 1981, we go back to spring and summer of 1950 when we find out that Ellie's father has just died and she's devastated. She loved her father, and what's going to happen now? And it's that they have no money, so she and her mother have to move to this neighborhood, and she meets Homa, and and the story goes on. And it goes back and forth between Ellie grows up and Homa grows up, and then something happens there. The something, which I'm not gonna, those of you who read it know, and those of you who don't will find out what the thing was. And there are some very clever twists and turns to the story. She keeps, and when she, in an interview, the interviewer said to her, you keep things, like when you're writing your story, how do you decide how much to tell and when to tell it? She said, that's the storyteller's craft, to know what to put in when, and it's even at the end, you keep getting a couple of little things. Just when you think you know the whole thing, then she throws in something else that makes you think again about a character. She wraps it up with us more or less a nice, satisfying ending as you can get with that extra bit in 2022. And thus the story closes. So it's a very interesting read. It teaches one, as I guess good historical fiction is meant to do, about a time and a place which is not in the distant past. It's most of it we can all remember pretty clearly. And if you look up a little bit, you could fill in the blanks. She said, and interestingly, she said that she made Ellie and Homa to be born in 1943, which was they're 7 years old when we meet them in 1950, at the same year as her mother, as the author's mother, because she said, I even wanted not just the historical facts, the political fact, but I wanted everything to read true because it's close enough that it should really be right. And so she said, by making the mother, by making the girls born in the same year as her own mother, the author's mother, she said, I could ask my mother all these questions about everything. So I think I got things right, you know, with the sights and the sounds and the foods and everything. She said that would have been Tehran in 1950, what I was writing about, and I checked and fact-checked with my mother. And she said, besides that, it turns out, I think it's Simon and Schuster is the publisher, Simon and Schuster also fact-checks, she says, even if it's fiction, they fact-check it to make sure that the political, you know, the actual dates and things that was all right. So this is a story of friendship that spans decades, you know, starts in the 1950s and it goes on to the early 1980s, other than that little postscript. She says it's not based on my own life because I wasn't alive for much of the time period. She was born in 1971, the author, and I made up characters of Ellie and Homa. However, I drew on a lot of my own emotional experience. I know what it's like to take comfort in and have the great privilege of having a good friend. I know also what it's like to have that friendship ruptured. So while I made up the characters of Ellie and Homa, a lot of their emotional dynamic is based on what I know to be the true joys and challenges of friendship. And that's what she writes about here so beautifully, as well as her difficult relationship with her mother and coming at the end to an understanding, which as she said, in her own life, she realizes once you have children of your own, you appreciate your parents very much more. And then, of course, there's a whole political situation in Iran, which has taken on a whole new dimension and continues to do so even more pressingly for the rest of the world and the Middle East as we sit here and as we speak. So a very good story, an easy read, but with substance and seemingly the facts, the historical part of it are accurate, so you can sit back, because that always makes me nervous if it's, I'm always thinking if it's not, and enjoy the story and this beautiful tale about the power of friendship, loyalty, truth, being faithful to a friend, and really that's, as she says, what life is all about. Thank you very much. If anybody wants to questions or anything, yes.
We were surprised that you would write in English, but the Shah's wife, her name is Farah Diba. She also wrote in French about her life.
Right.
And I'm Lebanese.
Yeah.
A lot of authors in Lebanon wrote in
French. Right, French, I know that is, yeah.
It's a very hard language.
Yeah.
And the Arabic is different from the literary Arabic.
Right.
So
right.
in the Middle East, people
wrote, if they were like educated enough to write in whatever language they were schooled in, right? Whether it was the British with the English schools or the French with the, you know, with the French schools. Right.
Yeah.
And in Iran, it's not Arabic too. That's what's interesting. It's Farsi, which is like such a different language, and there's and a different culture, and you know, originally they were not.
The culture is more or less the same in all the regions. Like they offer you something.
Oh yeah, and you have some rights about that. Oh no, I can't. Again.
No,
Yeah.
the third time you take.
Did you read the book? Did you read it?
Yes.
Oh yeah,
because
right.
she said-
Oh okay, because she says that. She called it, she has the name in Farsi, what it is, that you have to, if you're polite, then you do this back and forth. You don't accept it the first time. That's very rude. No, you couldn't do it, I was gonna put you out. Da, 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 da. So yeah. Anybody else? Any comments? Any?